right, okay, it is noon, so we're going to go ahead and get started. It looks like everybody's kind of already trickled in here. So thank you guys so much for joining us today. My name is Jamie Gardner. I'm the marketing coordinator here at DRA, and I will be your host and moderator for today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. Our webinar today is called Navigating Reasonable Accommodations, What to Know, starring our employment team from DRA. So this is a webinar. If you haven't already noticed, your video and audio are automatically turned off for the duration of this event. If you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A, and there'll be time at the end of this webinar for a Q&A session. We also ask that you help us to keep this session as accessible as possible by limiting chat posts. Please use the private message feature to say hello to friends and have any side conversations. This will ensure that our attendees using screen readers can hear speakers as everything that is posted in the chat pane is read aloud by their screen reader devices. If you have any event-related issues, message me directly. My screen name will read DRA Communications. This session is recorded and will be available along with our resources shortly afterwards. If you need closed captioning, there is going to be a option down at the bottom of the screen, and we will also have a link posted in the chat as well. So now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Molly Hernandez, and thank you guys so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you everyone for joining us for Navigating Reasonable Accommodations, What to Know, presented by the Disability Rights Arkansas Employment Team. At Disability Rights Arkansas, our mission is to vigorously advocate for and enforce the legal rights of people with disabilities. We envision an Arkansas where people with disabilities are equal parts of their communities and set the course for their own lives through self-determination. We treat all people with dignity, respect, and compassion. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the members of our employment team, beginning with Jen Goodwin.
Hi guys, thanks for having me here today. I'm one of the attorneys here with Disability Rights Arkansas. So I'm also a person with a disability, so I have a spinal cord injury. So I have navigated the world of accommodations personally, as well as helping people professionally. So look forward to diving in, and I will pass it over to, I believe, Molly.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. So as you've heard before, my name is Molly Hernandez. I've worked on employment issues for Disability Rights Arkansas since 2019. And like Jen, I am also a person with a disability. I'm blind, so I very much know what it's like to navigate work and disability, including requesting reasonable accommodations. So we're excited to talk with you about that today. And now on to my colleague, Wednesday Kramer.
Hi, my name is Wednesday Kramer. I'm also an advocate here at Disability Rights Arkansas on the employment team. And I was born with spina bifida, so I use a wheelchair. So I have not only assisted people professionally with reasonable accommodations, but I myself have personally had to navigate them. So let's get started with this topic. We are first going to start this presentation by talking about definitions, so that way we're all on the same page when we use certain words. So we are going to start our definition section of this presentation by defining disability. So the definition of disability we're using today is a physical or mental condition that significantly limits a person's ability to perform major life activities, such as walking, seeing, hearing, or speaking.
And the reason we chose this particular definition is it's the Americans with Disabilities Act definition of disability. So it's rather broad. And we thought this was important because oftentimes you may not realize that you actually could qualify as a person with a disability. And I can use myself as an example here. I am blind due to a degenerative condition. So I spent a lot of time losing my sight and being a person simply with a vision impairment. And I didn't realize that during those times I could have requested accommodations as a person with a disability. I kind of had that feeling of, well, I'm not blind yet, or I'm not blind enough. So this definition is very important for helping you look at yourself and your situation to know if you qualify as a person with a disability by this definition. Next slide, please.
Next, we'll look at a reasonable accommodation definition. So it's a modification or adjustment to a job, the work environment, or the way things are usually done during the hiring process to ensure equal opportunity in the application process, to enable a qualified individual with a disability to perform the essential functions of a job, and to make it possible for an employee with a disability to enjoy equal benefits and privileges of employment.
So while this definition may seem rather straightforward, there's a couple of things I want to point out here. First, it talks about accommodations in the hiring process. You might need a reasonable accommodation just to navigate the application and interview process, and that's okay. You can request that. It's not just once you're working. The second thing I want you to be aware of is that phrase essential functions, and we're going to address that a little further very soon. So next slide, please.
And that's the time to address it is now. Essential job functions. They can be defined as job duties that are fundamental to the position. They are the reason the job exists. Some of the factors for determining what the essential functions of a job are include whether the position exists specifically to perform these essential functions, the number of employees who are available to perform the same job duties, and the expertise or skills required to perform the essential function.
So when you apply for a job, there's typically something within the application that asks, can you perform the essential functions of the job with or without a reasonable accommodation? So when you're looking at those essential functions, it's just like Wednesday said on this slide, it's the reason the job exists. So it is necessary to the job to be able to do those functions. If it's not an essential function, it's something called a marginal function. But for our purposes today, we're really going to talk about those essential functions and how you could be reasonably accommodated. All right, next slide, please.
Next, we'll look at what is reasonable. So reasonable means feasible or plausible, possible to provide without undue hardship. An undue hardship is an action requiring significant difficulty or expense, and it must be effective to enable the applicant to compete or employee to perform essential functions.
So undue hardship is something that, it's a bar that has to be proven. It's something that you would have to look at, and that can vary based on the size of your employer, the business, the corporation, what might be too expensive to provide as an accommodation, or too difficult if they're going to have to, do some physical remodeling or things like that, and it's not something that the employer can afford. And another thing in looking at it being reasonable, and I'll give kind of an over the top example using myself, talking about what would be essential to the job and being reasonable. I've told you before, I'm blind, but what if I make it through the hiring process for a trucking company, saying, well, I got a job, I'm going to be a cross-country trucker, but then I disclose after the fact, oh, you didn't notice this in our Zoom interview, but I'm blind and I can't actually get a driver's license and drive a truck. Well, there's absolutely no way that can be accommodated. I cannot perform the essential functions of the job. Trying to ask a trucker to, if it existed, get a self-driving truck, that would probably be an undue hardship. So again, an over-the-top example, but it's letting you know you do have to look at the essential functions and decide whether or not an accommodation would exist that would be reasonable to allow you to perform those essential functions. Next slide, please.
And we wanted to give you some examples of what a reasonable accommodation could look like. So that could be providing or modifying equipment or devices, job restructuring, part-time or modified work schedule, adjusting or modifying examinations, training materials, or policies, providing qualified readers and interpreters, telework, making the workplace readily accessible to and usable by people with disabilities, and reassignment to a vacant position.
So these are all examples of what could be considered reasonable, but understand everything is taken on a case-by-case basis. It depends on your job, your employer, and what you're needing to be successful within your job. So while we're giving these as examples, we can in no way say this would absolutely be something that your employer could provide. Next slide, please.
Next, we'll look at what reasonable accommodations do not include. So it doesn't have to remove essential functions. You don't have to have lowering of production standards, creating new jobs or bumping coworkers, providing personal need items such as hearing aids and wheelchairs, or providing accommodations that create an undue hardship.
And again, this slide I feel like is fairly straightforward, but just have that understanding that, sometimes there are just limits to what can be done to provide an accommodation. If the job exists for a specific reason, you can't change the reason behind why the job exists and have job duties exchanged out. There may not be another position that you could be put into. There's a lot of reasons and a lot of things that go into establishing what can and cannot work as you're navigating this process of requesting a reasonable accommodation. Next slide, please.
Next up, we're going to talk about the importance of reasonable accommodations, why they should be provided, how to ask for them, and why, as a individual with disability, it's important to advocate for yourself. Next slide, please. So why provide reasonable accommodations? There are a lot of studies out there that show the various benefits of providing reasonable accommodations and hiring people with disabilities. A recent study shown that direct benefits can include increased employee retention, increased employee productivity, and increased employee attendance. For some indirect benefits, they found that there were improved interactions with coworkers, an increased overall company safety, and there was an increased overall in company morale. There are also tax benefits to providing reasonable accommodations. This is definitely when you would want to talk to an accountant and look at the IRS's website, but some include the burial removal tax deduction and the disabled access credit. And it's also important to provide reasonable accommodations because it meets the legal obligations under Title I of the American with Disabilities Act, which we're going to talk about in a minute, or similar laws when it's applicable to you as a business owner, for those that might be business owners watching.
And there seems to be a myth out there that providing accommodations to people with disabilities is expensive. And it has been proven that oftentimes these accommodations can be at no cost or very low cost. And most of the time, accommodations cost less than $500 to put into place. And another thing I always want to point out is the benefits are proven to hiring people with disabilities. So employers need to know that. But if you are a person with a disability, go in there knowing that you're an asset. No one is doing you a favor to hire you. You are getting this job because you have skills that an employer needs. And if you need an accommodation, well, that's why this next slide will exist. The Americans with Disabilities Act, Title I, is what does protect you as a worker with a disability and what will allow you to request a reasonable accommodation.
Okay. And the Title I prohibits discrimination against qualified individuals with disabilities in all aspects of employment, including the hiring, firing, promotions, and job benefit stages.
Yeah, so we've got this slide here so that you are aware that this law, most people are aware that it exists. It passed in 1990, so it's been around quite some time. But again, it's not a perfect world and things don't always happen according to how they should. So please be aware and be informed about Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act.
It requires employers to provide reasonable accommodations to employees with disabilities unless it causes undue hardship. Employers cannot ask about disabilities during hiring. Employers must keep medical information confidential. It applies to both job applicants and employees, ensuring equal opportunity in the workplace.
So again, these are the components, what it can and cannot do for you. So be aware of it, know it, and implement when necessary.
Now we want to talk about when to ask for reasonable accommodation. If you are needing a reasonable accommodation, the timing and disclosure might be varied depending on your circumstance, but generally you should request a reasonable accommodation as soon as you think you have difficulty performing essential functions of your job because of your disability. And it's really important that you don't wait until you're getting written up to request a reasonable accommodation.
Yes, we can't be clear enough about the fact that you will be the one that needs to request this. Like your boss, your supervisor will not request a reasonable accommodation for you. So as soon as you feel like you are going to need an accommodation, ask for it. And you're going to hear this over and over again. You can ask for it verbally, but we strongly recommend that it is best practice to also request it in writing, just to have that documentation that you did disclose that you are a person with a disability and that you do need an accommodation, and you want to begin that interactive process to see what might work to help you complete your job.
So next up, we have our first poll question. We are going to have 3 throughout this presentation today. So you should see it popping up any second. And I'll read it for y'all, and you'll have a few minutes to answer. So the first poll question is, what title of the American with Disabilities Act provides protections related to the employment of people with disabilities? Is it Title III, Title II, or Title I? Okay, yes, so I see the majority, 80% of those that responded said Title I. That is correct. So Title I of the American with Disabilities Act is the act that provides protections related to the employment of people with disabilities. So now we're going to move on to our next section, which is about the interactive process. So you've heard us define various terms. You've heard us say, why asking for and providing reasonable accommodations is important. And now you might be asking yourself, well, what does that look like? How do I ask for reasonable accommodation? What are kind of the steps in the process? And while there are no formal guidelines or laws or rules that you have to follow in order to participate in the interactive process and ask for and provide reasonable accommodations, there are some guidelines out there that could be helpful. And so that is what we're going to go through today. So we recommend using these 6 steps when going through the interactive process of providing reasonable accommodations. So step 1 is recognizing an accommodation request. Step 2 is gathering information. Step 3 is exploring accommodation options. Step 4 is choosing an accommodation. Step 5 is implementing the accommodation. And step 6 is monitoring the accommodation. And we're going to break down each step and talk more about them. So step 1, recognizing an accommodation request. So if an individual needs a reasonable accommodation, individuals don't have to directly say, I'm requesting a reasonable accommodation. Now, if someone does need one and they do say it that way, I think that can be helpful, but you don't have to directly say it that way. You could say something along the lines of, I'm having a difficulty time at performing my job duties. Is there something that can be done to help me perform in my duties and to do a better job? And again, while you don't have to, we strongly recommend requesting it in writing. Of course, you can have an in-person or phone conversation with HR, your supervisor, but it is also helpful to follow that up with a request in writing so you do have that documentation. And it is important that the employer responds within a timely manner. Now, there also is no law or rule that says, what timely manner means. But my suggestion is if you have asked for a reasonable accommodation and you haven't heard anything in a week to follow up. So we say about a week or so, there should start to be some conversations. And this on your screen right now is a template of a sample accommodation request letter. This was actually taken from the Job Accommodation Network, which we will talk more about in a few slides. But on their website, they do provide examples of what accommodation request letters look like. This current one on the screen is just a template. So, date of letter, you would put your name, your address, your employer's name and address, the greeting, and then content that you should consider in the body of letter, including things like identifying yourself as a person with a disability, state they're requesting accommodations under the ADA, identifying the specific job task you're having issues with, any ideas that you have, and that asking your employer to respond to your request in a reasonable amount of time, and then your ending. This will be directly linked on the resource page that we have, and you'll receive all this information after the webinar in a post resource email. So next slide, please. Step 2 is gathering information. So you might be asked to provide medical history that's relevant to your disabling condition, and that's really the only medical history that needs to be provided. You might need to get something from a healthcare professional talking about your disability and the need for an accommodation. And if a disability and accommodation is obvious, records don't need to be obtained, but they can still be requested. And this is also the time in step 2 to sign any release of information that needs to be signed and make sure that all needed personnel and staff are informed of this process.
And if you've got a good relationship with your medical professional, you might encourage them that, this could be a timely issue, that you need to get that accommodation in place, that if there's any way that could expedite that paperwork, that's great, because sometimes that is something that we do see, that the request gets sent in and then there's some lag time before the medical information is actually provided to your employer.
Yes, and if you are even looking at work and you have a doctor's appointment, you could bring it up like, hey, I'm starting to look for work. I might need, potentially, depending on the job, a letter. So you might see that come through, my request for that, so they kind of have a heads up. Could be helpful. Next up is step 3, exploring accommodation requests. So to take a look at what might be good accommodation for the individual, you should consult with experts such as Stay at Work, Return to Work, that's at Arkansas Rehabilitation Services, which I'll talk about more in a moment, and the Job Accommodation Network, which that template that we talked about earlier is from that sample of a reasonable accommodation template. And then if an individual has had accommodations that have worked in the past at past jobs, it's important to suggest those, say like this is what worked before, and even say, this is what has not worked before. There are so many good resources online to also look and explore and see what's out there. So again, part of the way you can explore accommodation requests is that Stay at Work, Return to Work. And what they do is they have people in this office that can help you navigate the interactive process. They can help you identify appropriate accommodations related to your work duties and environment. And they're a great resource for both employees and employers. So if you're an employee trying to navigate reasonable accommodations, they can be contacted and we'll have that contact information for you as well. And if your employer like, hey, I'm not, I have this individual who needs this reasonable accommodation, what should I do next? They are a place you can reach out to and directly ask about what they think. And then that Job Accommodation Network, which I've mentioned a few times now, they are the leading resource of free expert and confidential guidance on job accommodations and disability employment issues. They offer free one-on-one practical guidance and technical assistance on job accommodation solutions, Title I of the American with Disabilities Act and related legislation, as well as self-employment and entrepreneurship options for people with disabilities. They have a lot of really great things on their website, including they have a new situation and solutions finder, so you can actually pick what disability or disabling condition you have, what job area you're in, and you might be able to find a situation that they have on there that can explain what some options are for you. They also have webinars that you can watch for free, a lot of resources on that website. So we highly recommend that you check that website out. And the website was just put in the chat too. So if y'all want to save that, you can. But like I said, we'll have that for y'all at the end as well. Next up is step 4, choosing an accommodation request. An employer may choose among effective accommodation solutions. It is nice to choose the accommodation that an employee prefers when possible. But, there has to be some conversations if, that may not be possible due to cost or other reasons, if there is another solution that could work for both parties. You can also consider a trial period when it's not clear whether the accommodation will work, or consider temporary accommodation if that's what's needed. And again, the accommodation you requested does not have to be the one your employer provides, as long as the one your employer provides is effective for your needs.
So an example of this might be if you're an individual who needs a medication during the workday that has to be refrigerated, your preferred accommodation might be that your employer purchase a mini fridge to keep in your work area, but that might not be feasible by the employer. The employer could, as an alternative, offer to get a locked, secure box to keep within a common refrigerator. And that might be something that would work just as well for you without as much of a hardship on the employer. So again, there is a difference between the accommodation that you want and the accommodation you might receive. It's always great if it is the one you want, but you do have to keep an open mind and work with your employer, because this is an interactive process. So there is some give and take and some trial and error.
And next up, we have step 5, which is all about implementing the accommodation. So it's important to let the individual know who's requested the reasonable accommodation, if it was approved or denied, and additional information, including if it was denied, why it was, and then if there's any alternatives, what those are. And then if it's approved, what the next steps would look like. You also would need to inform essential personnel about the accommodations. At the same time, it's important to maintain confidentiality of personal health and accommodation information. So we only want to share the information that is needed in order for the accommodation to be effective. Ensure all necessary steps are taken to implement the accommodation. So does something need to be purchased? Do schedules need to be moved around? Does the work environment, the workplace, does furniture need to be moved? What needs to happen in order for that accommodation to be in place? And again, documentation is strongly recommended. We frequently get calls of individuals who have worked somewhere for years and said, I had this accommodation, it worked really well for me. I was able to maintain my work. But then my supervisor left. I have a new supervisor who may not agree with the accommodation. They don't see anything in my file that talks about it, and they're not wanting to offer it. And it's because there wasn't anything officially written in the file. While there isn't anywhere in law that says that you have to have documentation somewhere, we strongly recommend it, so that way there aren't issues down the road. And then the last step is step 6, monitoring the accommodation. So set a time to check in, a couple weeks after the accommodations have been put in place, to see how things are going and if any adjustments need to be made. It's important to note that as soon as you realize an accommodation isn't working, to let the appropriate personnel know, so whether that be your supervisor, HR, or someone else. And then sometimes we see that employees are asked to recertify and get additional documentation from the healthcare professional, every so often, every 6 months, every year, to keep that accommodation. That really should mostly occur only if needed. And that really would happen if the original healthcare professional note wasn't specific enough or the disability has changed. And then you might need to get some updated information from your healthcare professional. And now we're going to have our second poll question, which will pop up for us any second. So the second poll question is, when should an individual with a disability request a reasonable accommodation? When they are facing disciplinary action at work, when they apply for a job, when they know they'll need an accommodation, or none of the above? So everyone got it right. When they know they'll need an accommodation, that's right. So sometimes that might be when someone applies for a job, but not always. So as soon as an individual knows that they'll need an accommodation, that's when they should request one. And next up, we're going to talk about what to do if the interactive process isn't working.
Okay. So there are 2 different processes, one for federal employees and then one kind of for everyone else. And so the first one that we're going to look at is the Equal Employment Opportunity, otherwise known as EEO, process for federal employees. So with this one, one of the key things is that there's a different timeline. involved there. So with an EEO claim, you have 45 days to file an internal complaint from the time of discrimination. So you'll be looking at informal counseling process or alternative dispute resolution with that. And then you're going to get a notice of right to file. You'll have 15 days to file at that point, and your case can either be accepted for investigation or dismissed. And then if it's accepted, you'll have 180 days to complete the investigation, or the agency will, and they will send a report of investigation, hearing with an administrative judge, or a final agency decision. And so with that, you'll get to make the choice on which one you want, if you want the agency to make the final decision or if you want to go before an administrative judge. Next, we'll look at the EEOC. So this is more your traditional, what you hear about from a lot of people, because it pertains to most people that are working. It's responsible for protecting you from employment discrimination because of your race, color, religion, sex, which includes pregnancy, gender identity, and sexual orientation, national origin, disability, age, being age 40 or older, or genetic information. So EEOC and your rights. So the EEOC prohibits an employer from treating you differently or less favorably because you're a parent or a friend, parent, or someone else you associate with has a disability, has a history of once having a disability, or is treated as having a disability. So this is different from what a lot of people think. They think it only involves your own personal disability, but you could also be discriminated against if you have a family member with a disability. So they think, oh, well, they're going to be out more because they've got a child with a disability, or maybe a parent, or somebody else that they care for. So employers are not allowed to discriminate based on any of those reasons. So it prohibits harassment at work by managers, coworkers, or others in your workplace based on a person's disability. I feel like that's pretty self-explanatory. So it's just saying, people can't harass you and cause you problems based on your disability or any of the other protected reasons. It gives you the right to request reasonable workplace changes to allow you to apply for a job, perform your job, have access to the workplace, or enjoy the same benefits available to other employees. That's pretty much what we've been talking about this whole time. And it does strictly limit what an employer can ask you about your health, and it requires an employer to keep any medical information you share private with very limited exception. So basically, whenever you are telling your employer that you need accommodations based on your health status, they're not able to blab that to the whole office or to anyone else. It needs to be held very confidential. And it protects you from being punished or harassed at work because you're someone you closely associate with complains about disability discrimination. So it's if you're griping about filing a complaint about being discriminated or discrimination for someone else, then it's going to keep the employer from being able to retaliate, which is something we'll get to as well. So EEOC and your responsibilities. So basically, it's pretty simple, and just don't discriminate. You should not treat your coworkers unfairly or harass them because of their race, skin color, national origin, the same list that we gave earlier: sex, including pregnancy, gender identity, and sexual orientation, religion, disability, or genetic information. So you shouldn't tell sexual or racial jokes at work or tease people because they're different from you. You need to report discrimination. So if you hear something, do something. A lot of people have heard that saying, so you should tell your company about any unfair treatment or harassment. Find out if your company has a policy on discrimination that specifies who you should contact about these issues. That would typically be your direct supervisor or someone in HR. And then request workplace changes. You have a responsibility to tell your company if you need a workplace change because of your religious beliefs, disability or pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical conditions. Your request does not have to be in writing, but you must provide enough information so your company can determine how to help you. While it says it does not have to be in writing, your attorney friend here says put it in writing if at all possible. So next we'll look at filing a complaint with the EEOC. So that would be your first step, is report discrimination to the EEOC. So you can use multiple paths for that. You can use the online public portal to follow the complaint process. So you submit an online inquiry, schedule an interview with someone from EEOC to actually hear your complaint, what's going on, and then you're going to submit a charge of discrimination. So that's basically just formalizing your complaint. Ensure that you meet the time limits for reporting discrimination. In most cases, you must file a charge within 180 calendar days. So while that sounds like a long time, it really can creep up on you pretty quickly if it's like ongoing discrimination, that kind of thing. So just make sure that you are reporting it when it's happening. All right, there's different ways to file that complaint. You can do it online, you can call, you can go to in person to an EEOC office, or by mail. All right, retaliation is something that I mentioned earlier. And it's something that happens when an employer treats someone poorly because they engage in a protected activity. So protected activities can include filing or being a witness in an EEOC charge or investigation, talking to a supervisor or manager about discrimination or harassment, refusing to follow orders that would result in discrimination, or resisting sexual advances or intervening to protect others. So what retaliation can look like is it can be up to and including being fired for reporting, a demotion, so you're getting downgraded in your job scale. You're not getting the benefits that you would get otherwise, or the promotions that you would get, and then also intimidation or threats coming from people within the office based on your reports of discrimination. So if this happens, then you need to report the retaliation as well. So use the EEOC's public portal to report retaliation related to discrimination or harassment. So it's a similar process. Next, we're going to come to poll question number 3. So it's an employment accommodations question number 3. Federal employees must go through a different process to file a complaint against an employer for not providing reasonable accommodations. Is this true or false? Very good. Everybody got it right. So true, and federal employees do go through a different process when reporting their discrimination than just the general population. Very good.
So next up, we're going to go through some scenarios. So we're going to take turns reading the scenarios, and then we're all going to discuss them, kind of the steps of determining reasonable accommodations, and maybe some ideas that we have as well. So the first scenario is an individual who uses a wheelchair discovers that some of the pathways between desks in our office are too narrow for a wheelchair, and the break room is on a different floor, which is hard to get to. So first, that individual, has identified that they are having some difficulties in the office. So now that they know that, they should request a reasonable accommodation. So to start that, they could talk to their supervisor and HR in person, and then follow that up with an email formally requesting that this be looked into. So, one solution to this could be seeing if there's an alternative break room that would be available on the floor that the office is at. Also, is there a way to reconfigure the desks, or could that individual have their desk moved to a different part of this office space so that way they're not having to go in between a lot of the pathways in the hallways? They could be maybe towards the back of or the front of the office to accommodate that. Do y'all have any ideas?
Or maybe even move their workspace to the same floor as the break room, or if that's not possible and it is a little more difficult to get there, maybe they need some extra time at break to have some time to to get to the break room. And you guys will see during the scenarios, this is when you really just start brainstorming and trying to see what's workable and what's not. And I think, one thing we didn't talk about benefits of hiring people with disabilities is we're adaptable. Like, if you want to talk about different options and things, we'll try. We'll see if it works. So, we're very flexible, we're very adaptable, and we're used to having to brainstorm outside of the box solutions.
And if this individual wasn't sure what to suggest or wasn't sure what might be the best idea, they could contact Stay at Work, Return to Work to see what ideas they have.
Or the Job Accommodation Network. So there are resources that we're giving you kind of examples of when you could turn to these resources.
Okay, next scenario.
So the next one that we're looking at is an individual sometimes struggles to keep track of multiple tasks and gets overwhelmed when there's a lot going on. It's hard for them to prioritize what needs to be done first.
So on this one, when you're talking about distractibility, maybe they need a workspace that's in a more quiet area, kind of away from all the traffic going to and from the break room or things like that. Or do they need checklists or notebooks? There's different, even online, there's a lot of resources and things online to help you just with organizational strategies.
And it's important to think too that, some people are better with written communication and some people are better with visuals. And maybe a checklist needs to have some visuals attached to it to help as well. Okay, scenario 3, please. So scenario 3 is about an individual with low vision. They work in IT and they use a screen magnification software to view information on their computer. After about 6 hours of their 8-hour shift, they start experiencing considerable eye strain, and that leads to headaches that makes it challenging for them to continue working. What are some ways that they could accommodate, do y'all think?
Maybe they need a flexible schedule. That 6 hours jumps out to me. So maybe they either need some additional breaks brought in where they could rest their eyes, or a flexible schedule to where they might work more days a week, but less hours in order to reach, whatever hourly need they have as full-time or part-time. Another thing that kind of jumps out to me is they're using screen magnification and still getting a lot of eye strain. They might need an evaluation from a low vision specialist to see, are they using the appropriate software? Maybe they need to use a screen reader and not have to rely on their eyes as much. So there are a couple of options there they could look into. And this might be a case of trial and error and really working on a few different strategies to see what could help make them more comfortable and complete their work.
And a good agency for this situation to turn to, this individual, this employer, in this case, is Division of Services for the Blind, which we'll mention in a few minutes, but they are the state vocational rehabilitation agency in the state that helps individuals that are gaining or maintaining employment that have low vision or are blind. So next slide, please. So next we're going to talk about resources.
Yes. So the first resource we really want to make you aware of is Disability Rights Arkansas. We are the independent, private, nonpartisan, nonprofit protection and advocacy organization that's authorized by both state and federal laws to provide protection and advocacy services to people who have disabilities in the state of Arkansas. We are funded by 9 federal grants, and we work under priorities that are set each year by public survey. So if you have a disability and you're encountering an issue in a wide variety of areas, you need to reach out to us. If we can help you, we will let you know. But if we can't, if you're not meeting our priorities that are set forth underneath our grants, we'll try and point you in the right direction so that you need so that you receive the resources that you need. Then moving on, we have 2 state agencies in the state of Arkansas for vocational rehabilitation. And these agencies work to provide you a vast array of services to help you maintain, regain, or become employed for the first time. So the first one is Arkansas Rehabilitation Services, and that's more the general vocational rehabilitation for any disability that is not vision related. So then we can move on to the next slide for Division of Services for the Blind. They are our second state agency, and as you might have guessed, they serve people who are blind or have vision impairments who need very specialized services to help them maintain, regain, or become employed for the first time. Now, I'll be the first to tell you, disability does not exist in a vacuum. You might need services from both agencies, and that is certainly possible. You know, if you have some more complex needs, you might need to work with both the Division of Services for the Blind and Arkansas Rehabilitation Services. All right. Our next slide is the Americans with Disabilities Act National, and this will give you just a lot more information about the Americans with Disabilities Act and what your rights and responsibilities are within that act. So we want to make sure that you have that bit of information as well. And then I believe that leads us up to questions, ladies and gentlemen.
And there also is a slide of useful links that will be in this PowerPoint. So that way you can have information on everything we talked about and things that we didn't even talk about as well for you to look at when you need it.
So yeah, thank you guys all very much, and I hope you guys all enjoy this presentation. Does anybody in the chat have any questions or anything that they would like to ask our speakers today before we go ahead and go? I'll give you guys just a minute in case you guys do have any questions. We had a question asked earlier asking about public accommodation. So if you guys have any questions about public accommodations, please reach out to us either at our phone number or by visiting us on our website and filling out a request to help form. But does anybody have any questions about any employment related or workplace related accommodations today? Okay. Well, I just want to thank you guys again. Thank you, Jen, Molly, and Wednesday for your presentation. And I hope you guys all enjoyed it. And thank you so much for attending. We're going to go ahead and sign off for the day. My name is Jamie with Disability Rights Arkansas, and thank you guys so much for attending.